All right, we'll get back into getting everyone focused on our second presentation. 10 minutes goes fast. I know I'm cutting off conversations back there, but I was talking with someone real quickly. She's like, "Oh, I'd like to ask Amy such and such question. If you didn't get to Amy or Todd, in our breaks to ask them a question, that might be an opportunity for you to write it down on a card for us for our Q&A. Just another thought there, and you can get those to me anytime between now and good morning, by the way, for our third hour. I want to ask a question that I failed to do before Amy started. So sorry, Amy. I told you I would ask this question. I forgot to do that. I'm curious, for those in the room, how many of you are mental health professionals? If you'll raise your hand. If you're a mental health professional, okay, that's what I figured. We were about 50-50 in the room. So that's great. Okay. You didn't raise your hand. I think we know the answer to that question. Right. So I do want to be a little more personable in introducing Todd. Just a fun connection here. We met through Facebook, actually, which is like, really? How does? Well, y'all know how that works. But I started following a running group online and noticed that this guy was posting a lot about mental health and running. I'm like, who is this guy? So I started, checking him out and saw he'd written a book, and he's going to, of course, Amy's already mentioned his book. So I got a copy of the book, and as I was reading it, just noticed that he said, hey, I'm coming to, just posted online, I'm going to be running a race in Florida. I'm like, oh, I think I'll just reach out to him and just, see where that goes. So it led to him being here today and us connecting with Amy and putting all this together. So Todd has an incredible story that he's here to share with us, his story, but also give you insight to where his story has taken him in his in his work with advocacy. And that's just as passionate for him. He's going to mention another book that has recently been published. So I'll give the floor to him now and give him all the time that he has. So please welcome Todd Crush to the stage.
Sure, I know how to work this. Okay. My name is Todd Crush, and I will tell you that I'm a living example, living proof that there is no impossible, that with determination and love, support from mental health and family, we can overcome anything, absolutely anything. This first slide, you can see I did endure childhood abuse, primarily verbal abuse. There was some neglect and other isolation that happened to me. And you heard me playing piano. One of my coping strategies was, even at a very young age, at 3 or 4 years old, I would carry around, strips of white and black pieces of paper, because when I was isolated, I would sit there in the quiet and just play piano in my head. So it was a refuge from very early on. I struggled with that verbal abuse, and I'm really kind of skimming over this. My first book, From Beneath Ice, covers all this in extent, but we have limited time, and there's a lot I want to get to. That verbal abuse, that neglect, all left me with a very damaged and traumatized mind. I was removed from any sort of emotional content in relationships. Everything that I said or did as a child was used against me in a way often enough that I was afraid to put myself out there in any way. I also had that kind of worst case scenario thinking that developed, thinking that I was going to be a failure, that I was going to, end up just in a miserable state of life and relationships. I met my first wife and had some children in my early 20s, 3 children. And when I was 25, started having the symptoms of schizophrenia. This was in the 90s. The internet was very limited. I didn't really have any resources other than, movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is horrible, but that's all I had. And so I hid my hallucinations. I hid my trauma from everyone in my life. So to my wife and to my coworkers and my friends, all of a sudden, I stopped running, and I stopped working, and I stopped doing all the things I normally did, and I started drinking more. I started acting erratically, obviously to things that weren't in the room, but they were reacting to, or I was reacting to. And eventually that unraveled to a point where my marriage dissolved, and I, had a suicide attempt, and I went into group homes and, encountered some other actions. This is also in the book. I don't want to ruin that for you. That really disturbed me and scared me. Again, nobody knew what I was really struggling with. And when I discovered some of these aspects that could possibly happen with this illness, with hallucinations and everything else, I didn't know what else to do. And I really felt like I tried to make in my first book the point that this was a bad decision. I should have gotten help. I should have sought out, and my life would have probably taken a much different turn. But I just left. I loaded up a backpack and lived in the woods for several years. So you can see the aspects and the elements of that journey. And, recently things have come to mind come to light that I'm going to get to a little bit later. But there's aspects of guilt to this illness that my second book is about, where abandoning my family and going off and nobody knew where I was for 2 years caused tremendous trauma to them, and then guilt throughout my life because our relationships never recovered. And that's a severe case, but all symptoms are severe to the person that's having them. One of the participants in my model missed his son's graduation. There's guilt there. And then there's fear of his second son's graduation. Does he go? Does he risk having an episode in front of, or symptoms in front of everybody and all his friends? So that's been a big part of this. I resurfaced in Arkansas in 2010. That's where I live now. Came out of the wilderness in such severe psychosis. I didn't know my name. I didn't know where I had been. I had no memory of my past at all. I was like a blank sheet of paper, and it was the scariest experience in my life. I knew I had to get to the hospital, so I went to the hospital, and then from there went through what I'm sure a lot of the professionals here know and online, that I went through that hospital, home, hospital, on medication, off medication. I went through that whole cycle. In 2016, I was 297 pounds. And you can see the thing that strikes me about this picture, everybody says, well, it doesn't even look like you, and it doesn't really. I run a lot, so I've lost the weight, but the light in my eyes, it's gone. There's no light there at all. I was completely dead inside, and I was in survival mode for a long time. So then I rose to become an advocate, as John said. I work with hospitals, with universities, to change the way we talk about and treat mental illness. The warrior is a big thing for me, because for me as a warrior, it's just sticks, right? It works for me. Some of these slides are. What I do is to promote wellness through running, through writing, all of it. Certainly, I've encountered so many people that I've worked with through running, but also through advocacy and talking with individuals like yourself, that I think a big thing for running for me was with anxiety, especially and paranoia with my schizophrenia. I had a lot of difficulty leaving the house. I was agoraphobic. I just could not leave for several years after I returned arrived in Arkansas. Well, running was one of the things that allowed me to kind of use exposure therapy to lessen that anxiety. So obviously I don't have it now very much. I'm a little nervous, but not too much. And I think that running was a way, at first when I went just around the block with anxiety or running and a hallucination would start and this person is running around and ringing doorbells and I just kept running through it. It's kind of like skydiving. If you do it the first time, you're going to be terrified, but if you do it every day for a year, by New Year's, you're going to be jumping out backwards, blindfolded probably. So let's get to a patient's perspective. This slide really represents for me, I keep wanting to walk over. Schizophrenia for me is, I only have about 4 or 5 hallucinations. They're repetitive. I'm sure I probably have some ones that are innocuous, like a car that isn't, I didn't even notice. But what this illustrates is that for me, the way I explain it to doctors and everybody else is that we all have bizarre dreams. So in this image, even if I was a woman and I'm on a paper airplane flying over a city, that's really bizarre. But while we're dreaming that, we don't question it. It happens every single day. It's only when we wake up that our rational brain kicks in and we go, well, that was kind of weird. And then we tell our friends about it. But for me, the hallucination is the same way. When it appears and it happens all the time. I don't question it. I'm completely fooled and immersed in it. As my growth through this and my understanding towards it progressed, that rational brain kicked in faster and faster, to the point that on March 6th, last year was the last day I had any symptoms whatsoever, anxiety or anything else. And I remember it not so much because the hallucinations were kind of off and on, but the anxiety just stopped. And there's several things that I think contributed to that, and I'll get into those. What's helpful to me during hallucination, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, is calm voices, minimal touch, distraction. Distraction has been one of the biggest ones. And when I talk about distraction, for me it was important to have things I could do anywhere. I do enjoy math, and I know a lot of people don't, but it's one of those things that interrupts our thought process. So if you were to try and add three-digit numbers in your head and also have a conversation at the same time, you can't do that. It's the same with intrusive thoughts or anxious thoughts. That process is interrupted. Good luck trying to get somebody to do math. Anyway, so anxiety is a lot of the same thing. One of the big things for me here was reassurance of safety, especially if I was in a crisis situation, if I was in a hospital or in an emergency situation with an ambulance. Reminders to self-soothe. I think a lot of times we talk about breathing techniques and doing math and things like that, but we do them in a crisis situation. But if we wait until that situation, it's not going to work. Our brain doesn't know. We're already we're too much into that panic state. We don't know our brain doesn't know where we're trying to go. So, a thing I did, I would do my breathing exercises right away when I woke up, even though I was already completely relaxed, unless I had a bad dream or something. And then my brain knew that process of where I was trying to get it to go. Okay, there. It keeps moving. Paranoia is a little bit different, and along with that comes some delusional aspects. Distraction is very good. The one I want to talk to on here is constructive failure. And if anybody wants this thing, I'll send it to you. I can email it to you.
Sorry, I forgot to say, a copy of his PowerPoints are in your bags.
Done. Thank you, John. Rockstar. So constructive failure is something I practiced specifically with paranoia, but also with other aspects, like with running further and further through my anxiety. Constructive failure is something so when I lived in my apartment, I was afraid to leave. I was agoraphobic, and I would leave. I'd set a goal to be outside for 5 minutes. I'd be out there, and I'd see a woman in the window, and immediately the thought would come that she's calling the police. Or I would see a guy going into the building, think he's going to put cameras in my apartment. Well, I would go back in, I would calm down, I would take out a notebook, and I would write down those intrusive thoughts after I was calm, and then I would write down rational answers. The woman is looking for her cat. the man is delivering a letter, whatever it was. And then the next day I would take that notebook with me outside with a new goal. And even though those intrusive thoughts might have been different when I read my answers, it reset my brain to rational thinking much quicker. So that's what constructive failure is. And I have a lot more of that in my book and my research of different aspects. The trauma from mental illness wasn't really present in any of my treatment. This is something that could be any sort of event that's caused by mental illness, whether you leave work because you're in the hospital or you drink too much and you miss a wedding, or, whatever it is, as your coping mechanisms. But the difference is for me is that, I had both. I had an abusive mother, but I can avoid that. I haven't talked to her for 15 years. And it's horrible. Abuse is terrible. Don't get me wrong. But if with time and distance, an external abuser, it fades a little bit. At least it did for me. That's not the same with my mental illness because it's with me everywhere. It's like as if I was handcuffed to somebody that was doing that to me. That's why the coping skills are different. This is a main contributor to what my second book is about, and that's the repetitive guilt from mental illness. And that is what I had talked about before with missing a graduation, with me abandoning my family, with what happened recently with my wife. All of it has been one guilt aspect after another. And I actually, came up with an analogy that I feel like all my loved ones are in the room and I'm a toddler playing with a grenade because I don't see it coming, and it destroys everything over and over again. And that's hard guilt to live with over and over. So again, not addressed in literature, from family events to major hallucinations. I struggle with the consequences of this. We had no model for this. Back in, I think, March, I looked to see, we have the model for grief. We have the Kubler-Ross model for grief, but there's nothing out there really for guilt as far as a treatment model. So I created one. Now, you'll notice this isn't circular. It's, you can come at it every which way. And I also tried to kind of put things around in different ways. We have some neutral ones here like apathy, detachment, I guess maybe sort of acceptance would be somewhat neutral, although it's a big step. You'll notice fear is on here twice. And the reason fear is on here twice is because, at least for me and a lot of the people that are participants in the model and thousands of people I've worked with, there's a fear of your own actions in the moment. But then even after you get through resolution or awareness or forgiveness, there's a fear that it's all going to happen again. And that has happened to me over and over. And a lot of people just, they can't keep going with that, which is sad. And I almost died several times. This is a quote from Voltaire. I think this says to me that we all try to do good. At least I think, most of us do. But what about the times where we believe we're doing good and there's things under the surface or behind all that, which is what my quote is about, that, this is going to come no matter what I do. I just have to keep pushing through and understanding as best I can. I had fun with the transitions. It's fun. So how do we mitigate this? A big part of it for me was reprogramming that negative thought cycle that I had from my abuse as a child, and then also was perpetuated by my continuous cycle through stages and examples of my mental illness. Forgiveness and patience with myself was enormous. It's ongoing. It's something I'm really struggling with a lot now. Embracing new challenging situations was a big part of it. With running is a good example. Music is another good example. When I first met my wife, I could not even go to an open mic without, really struggling, without, alcohol and everything else, just to get up and play one song. And now I do, several shows a year with just having fun. So I think with that exposure therapy and with a lot of support and encouragement from loved ones, you can really change the game. The void is something I talk about a lot, and these next three here are big parts of that. I think whether we have mental illness or not, or whether we have trauma or both, what have you, a lot of us have that void inside that, and maybe it's the things we did we regret, or maybe it's, other aspects that were brought to us that we think about, how we think about ourselves or our place in the world. For a long time, I put, relationships and cars and, all kinds of stuff down into that, alcohol down into that void. But until I turned the other way and, with Leslie, my wife, by my side, I was able to actually go into that void and look around at all the dark parts and accept them and be aware of them and forgive them and really move through. Now, that, as Amy said, you've got to have a good support system for that. That is easily the most difficult and almost excruciating process I went through. And I was lucky to have her support and a great medical team on my side too. But if that's not there, that is almost an impossible process. It's impossible enough if you are as supported as I was. And that's something in my advocacy work, when I work with individuals, that I really try to stress, because that, all of you know, the medical professionals especially, that's a very difficult process. So what does the guilt look like? These are the participants in the model. William was one of the first. These names have been changed. He presented with schizophrenia, detachment, fear, self-blame. He was living alone. The only communication he had with his family was letters delivered in the middle of the night that were kind of, almost cryptic in nature. His fear, he missed his son's graduation, was left with guilt from that, as I said. There's a certain level of emotional exhaustion. Amy touched on that a little bit with families, where, when I got involved with his process, I was actually working with his family. They were protecting their own mental health at this point, and that was a big part of the process for them. The second one was Sydney. She was a successful businesswoman, actually the main breadwinner of the family. Her depression got so severe that her husband said, all right, we're at ultimatum time. So he was either going to, take her right then or go to the hospital. Her guilt came in that her doctor immediately mandated a leave of absence. Now, she had a certain amount of, whatever, sick time and everything, but eventually it caught up. And that created a lot, not just in that, but her feeling of the stigma. What if my coworkers find out, or, why they're going to wonder why I'm gone? And she had a lot of incidences with her family where she would, yell at her daughter, or, for really no reason. And these kinds of things really, even now, she's having a lot of trouble forgiving herself for that. This is the guilt from mental illness itself. This last one, and I'm going to touch on the violence aspect of this later, there is a perceived violence. I've never been violent in my life. Lucinda presented with depression. She was, her family was very stoic, and I think this is something that I've kind of discovered, not just from my perspective. I'm 52, so my parents, that generation, was a World War II generation. You didn't talk about it. We didn't want the family anybody outside to know what was going on. Sometimes even inside the family, what was going on. Well, that created this whole stoic kind of wall of defense that nobody talks about anything. And I think it's dangerous for everyone, and we're witnessing the crisis of it right now. But I think it's especially difficult for men. I have worked with thousands of people, mostly through Facebook and other places, individuals with mental illness, and probably 7% of them are men. I mean, just very few. And even those are more likely to just, as Amy said, they come in, they talk to you, and then they're gone. And I had a statistic come across me that said men are 10 times more likely to carry through with a suicide attempt their methods are much more immediate and severe, typically, and they're 25% less or 40% less likely to tell anybody before they do it. And women are almost the opposite. So that's an aspect of this that, I've just started to get into, but really tried to help with. Lucinda threatened her brother through a company email. She was in kind of a blackout state through her depression and also alcohol. Didn't know until the next morning when she saw her face next to the picture of the building being evacuated by the SWAT team on the news. So it wasn't violence, but it was threat of violence. Really quickly, sometimes she was imposed to go to AA. I don't have any problem with those kind of programs at all. I think in general they're a good idea, but I think sometimes what happens is, especially if you have someone that has mental illness and they get into one of those situations, all of a sudden they're coming from this level of trauma where they're feeling like a burden to everybody, and they get into that group and all of a sudden they're an expert. And they don't have to work on, they can just help everybody else, and there's this kind of removed action step that happens. I've seen it quite a bit. So what are your buttons? I was in a group home back in like 2000 sometime, and I was saying how my mom really knew how to push my buttons, and the therapist looked at me and she said, "What are your buttons?" And I had no idea. And it completely changed the dynamic between my mom and myself. All of a sudden, when I felt that anger rising or that defensiveness, building, I thought, well, why am I feeling it? It became an educational experience versus fighting back. Above and beyond this, I think other people pushing our buttons is one thing. We can recognize that, but I realized just about 2 years ago through this process that I was pushing my own buttons. And again, that's something that I have to be aware of. Almost like if you think of like the Charlie Brown with the thoughts above his head over here, those would be the ones coming from the abuser. But if you move that bubble right in front of your face and you see your own thoughts and you witness those buttons being pushed, that made a big difference in my life. And I would journal everything. I would write everything down. So how did I go from being afraid to go to the mailbox to running without fear, running in other states, running this morning with John? How did I do that and stand here now with virtually no anxiety? And one of the big things, and caregivers don't like this, but we all know the phrase, you can lead a horse to water. Nothing changed until I decided I had to do it. That's the same through all of this with everybody. Everybody told me what I had to do, but it didn't stick. So what was the first thing? The first thing was becoming vigilant about medications and treatment. Again, that had to come from me. One of the things that I got initially from my parents when I was on, things early on, like when I was 12, 13, all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to have any sort of emotional response I didn't get, "Are you okay?" or "How can I help?" I got, "Did you take your medication?" So it removed that human element for me that all of a sudden I was just supposed to be this perfect kid, and when it didn't fix it, then I felt like even more of a burden. Side effects, we all know about that. For me, I have a bipolar aspect to my illness, and when I'm off medication, I feel like Superman. It's an amazing, you got to be careful with that. And, but that was one of the main aspects for me. Accessibility is something I want to talk about in the Q&A. I hope somebody will ask about that. I've experienced a lot with lack of accessibility, not just from the system, but with my own anxiety. It was hard to go, before COVID happened and we have all this telehealth now, it was hard to go to you can imagine somebody who hallucinates fire people jumping off the lawn on his way to get his medication at Walmart, how hard that would be to keep going to Walmart to get your medication. I realize I just advertised Walmart. Anyway, the delusion and confusion was bad. I had a delusion where I had a phone call with my doctor where she changed my medication. but it never actually happened. So I was taking my medication incorrectly. And again, I was living by myself, so nobody knew it. This slide is something that, for me, represents, here's a person with a ladder, and they're in a hole, right? The ladder represents medication. It might make me feel better. I might see the pathway, but I have to do the work. I have to climb the ladder. And what I'm talking about is there a medication that changes? I'm going to ask you, the medical professionals here right now, is there a medication that changes the way we think about our past, present, and future? I see a lot of no's. So why then are we treating people with medications alone and expecting this to happen? We need guilt aspects. We need those components. We need the treatment and the therapy. And I know that's hard to make people keep coming, but that's, I'll give you a really brief example. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks getting stabilized when I arrived in Fort Smith and in Arkansas and couldn't remember my own name. Spent 3 weeks stabilizing me. When I got discharged, I got a week of meds in a paper bag and a ride to the homeless shelter. What are the success rates for that? So one of the big final pieces was vulnerability with others and myself. This is my wife and I. And this is going to be largely unscripted. We divorced this year, largely due to the effects of confabulation. My brother reached out earlier this year, I think in March, and told us that there were elements of my past that were altered. The biggest one was probably that I had 2 backpacking trips of about 2 years, but in the middle of those, I was married for a year and then had a suicide attempt, but I don't have any memory of that whatsoever. Not that woman or her name or anything else. Well, this created obviously a tremendous rift of trust and everything else in my marriage. We have recently begun talking again, and it's been amazing. But from the beginning of my story, Leslie was there. Our first phone call, she wanted me to say, "I'm amazing," over and over. It was great. The impossibles were achieved together, encouraging, supportive. Again, things a lot of people with mental illness don't have in relationships, or that level of support. And that's something that I think, it was more than, and there's a dangerous line there, right, between enabling and being supportive. One of the things she changed about my landscape and saved my life so many times was that when I struggled or when I wasn't the best version I could be, she told me about it. She said, "Hey, here's what you could have done better with this." So Into the Void, that was what I talked about before with Writing from Beneath the Ice. That's my first book. I wanted to show you this. I don't have a slide of this. This is my new book, The Repetitive Guilt from Mental Illness. You can see the cover of this is abandoned cabin, and that's me standing through on the other side. You can look at that a little bit later. But with my relationship with my wife and with my kids and with basically my friend, every relationship I've had, this mental illness has created these situations where I build this house of joy and then I wake up one day and it's a shell and it's dark and it's scary and confusing and I can't see it coming. So this is something I just put in here about 2 days ago. I was talking with Amy this morning. People with mental illness, even trauma or both, are way more likely to be targeted by abusers. They already have social isolation. It exacerbates their mental health condition. Their reality can be undermined. So, meaning, well, that person has this, and that's why when the reports of violence or the reports of abuse can be seen as unreliable, or they're seen as the crying wolf, kind of person that does this so much, the authorities are going, "Oh, okay," and they don't actually have the training to help with that. So let's talk about stigma. I was in a hospital had never been violent in my life. I don't think I even had a playground altercation with anybody. But I worked with a family that had a father who had dementia, and he would attack them when they came home because he didn't know who they were. Well, I've had hallucinations of people breaking into my apartment. Now, I would barricade myself in the bathroom with a knife or whatever. Now, those are different illnesses and different situations, but I was in the hospital, had to go to the courtroom to decide whether or not I was going to be voluntary. I was put in a jumpsuit with handcuffs, waist chains, shackles, and chained to the floor of a van and walked through the courthouse with an officer on all four sides. Like I felt like, and this makes somebody feel like a burden, like a criminal. Imagine if we did that to Grandpa when he went to the hospital for his dementia. And even the family is seen as different. His family gets compassion and understanding usually, and they get, can we help? Leslie got, are you sure you want to deal with that your whole, it's a very different stigma. She touched on this briefly. 4% of violence in the United States can be attributed to mental illness. And this is perpetuated by media, not just shows. I know there are scary shows like Criminal Minds, and that's the whole point. But there's such limited exposure to this. I've been on the local news a couple times, and I had to fight really hard to get there. Now, if I committed an act of violence, I guarantee you I would be on there without any effort whatsoever. And that's the difference. Mental illness is the only thing we treat people for what they might do. The only thing. This is something she touched on as well. I actually have her, we kind of duplicated here, but I think it's worth saying, the 25% of fatalities. Running did a lot for me. My wife did a lot for me. Writing did a lot for me. All those things took me from thinking I could be strong to proving I was every single time I was out there. Failing constructively. And this is the bottom shoe. I don't know if you can read that. It's my first run with Fred, who's a hallucination. And that was a day where my wife, I went out for a run, and I came back in like 2 minutes because he was out breaking windows and everything else. And I went in and I played music for a while, and then I came back out, and I was like, he's still there. And I said, yeah. And so she said, well, why don't you go out again? And I did, and I ran, and by the time I was done, he was gone. No, I'm not advocating that at all, that you shouldn't take your medication and you can just run this away. That doesn't work that way. It's a all-over approach to all of it. But it certainly was something that, again, like the slide with the ladder, you have to do the work, and whether that's running or knitting or playing piano or going to church, it doesn't matter. You have to do the work because the medication just isn't going to do it by itself. I guarantee that. I want to talk briefly about purpose. One of the things I struggled with a lot, I was on disability. I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't, do much of anything. And I had no purpose. My purpose was to be alive the next morning. And, as I started kind of emerging out of this and starting to be in public with my wife and her daughter and things like that, what's the first thing people ask you when you go to a school event? What do you do? Well, what do you say if you're, well, I kind of do what I need to do to cope so I'm alive the next day. That doesn't, yeah. And this will demonstrate the stigma. One of the first times I went to the open mic to play music, somebody asked me that question, and I for whatever reason, I just said, well, I'm on disability. And she kind of went like that. And so without even being prompted, I said, well, I have schizophrenia. She stepped back, which is just the most powerful image of stigma that you can have. But now I have purpose. Obviously, I'm here in front of you. And this is what I do. But that's not common. And I think a lot of individuals and participants I've worked with mental health, they are on that oscillation between, good and bad times with purpose. And it's very important. I mean, I feel like you have to have something. I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know if we can incorporate something like that into treatment centers where we give these people projects or, whether it's exercise or what have you. I actually got a donation they have these roll-out keyboards that are flat. I'm going to start sending them out in January. I got 100 of them. And so I'm going to be putting those in hospitals and treatment centers and things like that because, here's a trick for you. If you want to sound pretty good on the piano, just all black keys because it's a key minus one note, but if you just it'll sound good. But the aspect of that is if you have someone that's really struggling and needs that, music does the same thing that math does. It's the same center of our brain. Roll out that keyboard and they can go in there and detach from all their trauma and make something beautiful in that room, and they'll probably come out of that with more than they did with, almost anything. At least that would have been it for me. I went to one hospital where they actually had a piano, and every day while people did art, I played piano. And it was like the best thing about that whole experience. Because what happens in groups, in therapy, in hospitals, the food is terrible, and it's non-productive usually. At least it was in my experience. I missed the little button there. This is one of my favorite quotes. It stands by itself. And I think this goes back to purpose. What I did for myself was all I did. And for a long time, I think I came out of that with a real self-centered, selfish kind of defensive nature, where I felt like I was used to doing whatever I had to do to survive. I was in that fight or flight mode. I was in that survival mode. Well, that's hard to move out of when you start to feel better. One more thing about that real quick is that I think one thing I've noticed, and I know that a lot of you here are probably in more of a crisis situation, but I think there's an element to this that I've experienced and that I've seen in a few others where as wellness happens, as that person moves towards resolution, as I got healthier, the dynamic of my relationships changed. I had a friend, he's in my first book, Craig, who was always the one helping me. He, I don't know how else to do it. He wasn't above me, but he was always pulling me up, helping me out, checking on me, making sure I was okay. And then all of a sudden, when I started doing what I'm doing now, and got to the point where I wasn't really needing that, he actually reached out and started sabotaging by bringing up the past and all these things because I think he wanted me to be back where he didn't understand for so long. I don't even think he knew he was doing it, but for so long his identity was to be that helpful, strong person. And I've seen that a lot with caregivers and parents, especially parents, where they get that they get that target fixation that they have to secure wellness for their child, and when that isn't necessary, they kind of lose their purpose. So the purpose and that dynamic is on both ends of that spectrum. There we go. Thank you. If you have any questions, please do let me know. I know we're going to do that here in a bit, but I wanted to thank John and Amy for everything, especially working with both of them through some of the questions I've had. Amy and I talked at breakfast this morning about how she's got a very clinical side and I've got a very, almost soldier on the ground kind of in the battle kind of side. And the two of that is it's really powerful. So thank you so much for coming. And that's it. Thank you.